Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we re-journeying back to a moment that shook the world to its core. The spring of 1940 and the stunningly rapid collapse of France. In less than 6 weeks, a nation considered to have the most powerful army in Europe was brought to its knees. How did this happen? Let's dive into the story of May and June 1940, a period of chaos, disbelief, and national trauma. It all began on May 10th, 1940. 4 months, Europe had been in a state of strange, tense calm known as the phony war. Soldiers sat in their fortifications, staring across at their German counterparts, waiting for a move that never seemed to come. The French and British high commands were confident. They believed their strategy, centered on the formidable Maginot Line, was sound. This string of concrete fortresses, artillery emplacements, and machine gun posts was thought to be impenetrable, protecting France's eastern border. The plan was simple. If the Germans attacked, they would likely try to repeat their World War I strategy, a wide sweep through the Low Countries of Belgium and the Netherlands. The finest French and British divisions were poised to rush north to meet them, forming a solid defensive front. It seemed like a logical, well-prepared response. The soldiers were ready. The commanders were confident, but they were preparing to fight the last war, not the one that was about to hit them. Then, the storm broke. German forces didn't just invade the Netherlands and Belgium as expected. They launched a simultaneous, audacious thrust through a place the Allies considered impassable for a modern, mechanized army. The Ardennes Forest. This hilly, densely wooded region was only lightly defended. The French believed the terrain itself was the best defense. That tanks and heavy vehicles would get bogged down, making any large-scale attack impossible. It was a fatal miscalculation. While the elite Allied forces moved north into the Belgian trap, a massive German armored force, spearheaded by 7 panzer divisions, was pouring through the Ardennes like a river breaking through a weak dam. This was the sickle cut. The asterisk, Sichelschnitt asterisk, a brilliant and daring plan conceived by German General von Manstein. It was high risk, high reward, and it worked beyond their wildest dreams. By May 13th, the German tanks had crossed the Meuse River near Sedan, a name already infamous in French military history. French defenses, composed mainly of Secondret reserve divisions, crumbled under the shock and ferocity of the assault. The German Luftwaffe, the Air Force, played a terrifying role. Stuka dive bombers, with their Jericho trumpets wailing, created panic and chaos, shattering the morale of the defenders on the ground. They weren't just bombing military targets. They were a psychological weapon, a symbol of a new, terrifying form of warfare. With the Meuse crossed, the path into the heart of France was wide open. The German armored columns didn't stop to consolidate. They raced west, heading for the English Channel, their engines never cooling. Their speed was breathtaking, something the Allied command structure simply couldn't comprehend. They were still thinking in terms of days and weeks, while the Germans were operating in hours. The speed of the advance created a psychological paralysis. French and British commanders were receiving reports that seemed impossible. By the time they reacted to one crisis, the Germans were already 50 miles further west, creating a new, more desperate one. Communication lines were cut, units were bypassed and isolated, and the entire command structure fell into disarray. The Allied armies that had charged into Belgium suddenly found themselves being outflanked. The German sickle was swinging shut behind them, aiming to cut them off from the rest of France and pin them against the sea. Panic began to ripple, not just through the army, but through the entire nation. News from the front was confusing, alarming, then catastrophic. The government tried to maintain a sense of calm, but the facade was quickly cracking. For the civilians in northern France and Belgium, the invasion was an immediate, terrifying reality. The sound of artillery, the sight of German planes overhead, and the rumors of the army's collapse triggered a mass exodus. People packed what they could onto cars, carts, bicycles, or simply carried their belongings on their backs. Roads became choked with endless columns of refugees, a river of human misery flowing south, away from the fighting. This wasn't a strategic retreat. It was a desperate flight. These columns of refugees, which included women, children, and the elderly, tragically became entangled with military convoys, creating unimaginable traffic jams. Roads were gridlocked for miles. This not only slowed down any potential French military maneuvers, but also made the refugees easy targets for the Luftwaffe, which strafed the roads to sow more terror and chaos, compounding the disaster. The sight of these refugee columns became the defining image of the defeat, a nation dissolving on its own highways. By May 20th, the impossible had happened. German panzer divisions reached the English Channel at Abbeville. They had done it. They had cut the Allied forces in two. The best armies of France and the entire British Expeditionary Force were now trapped in a pocket with their backs to the sea, a pocket that was shrinking by the hour. The strategic situation was hopeless. The Belgian army, after fighting bravely, was on the verge of collapse and would soon surrender. The remaining French and British troops in the pocket converged on the small port town of Dunkirk, the only possible escape route. The miracle of Dunkirk, the evacuation of over 338,000 soldiers, was a logistical triumph and a testament to human resilience, but it was also the seal on a strategic catastrophe. The British army had escaped, but they had left behind all their heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, and vehicles. The best of the French army was either captured or disbanded. With the north secured, the Germans turned south to finish the job. On June 5, they launched Operation Vollrot, the second phase of their invasion. The remaining French forces, depleted, demoralized, and without their best units, tried to form a new defensive line along the river Somme-Nain, known as the Weygand Line. But it was a desperate, hopeless stand. The French army was a shadow of its former self. There was no reserve, no strategic depth, and no answer to the German blitzkrieg tactics. The German war machine, now battle-hardened and supremely confident, smashed through the line with ease. The French government, which had already fled Paris, was in a state of total collapse. The political leadership was divided in Paris. Some, led by the new Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, wanted to fight on, perhaps from North Africa. Others, led by the aging World War I hero, Marshal Pétain, argued that further resistance was futile and would only lead to the complete destruction of France. On June 10th, the situation became even more dire when Italy, sensing a German victory, declared war on France, opening up another front in the Alps. It was a cynical move, a stab in the back, as it was called. 4 days later, on June 14th, a day of profound national humiliation, German troops entered an eerily quiet and undefended Paris. The government had declared it an open city to spare it from destruction. The sight of swastika flags flying from the Arc de Triomphe and the Eiffel Tower sent a shockwave across the world. For France, it was the ultimate symbol of their defeat. The debate within the French government reached its climax. Reynaud resigned, and Marshal Pétain, the hero of Verdun, became the head of state. On June 17th, he addressed the nation by radio, his weary voice delivering the words the nation had been dreading. "It is with a heavy heart that I tell you today that we must stop the fighting." Negotiations began, and on June 22nd, 1940, in the very same railway carriage in Campion, where Germany had signed the armistice ending World War I, France signed its own surrender. The humiliation was complete. In just 6 weeks, the Third Republic was dead. The country was divided into an occupied zone in the north and west, and a supposedly free zone in the south, governed by Pétain's collaborationist regime from the city of Vichy. The fall of France wasn't just a military defeat. It was a psychological and moral collapse. It left the world stunned and left Britain to stand alone against the might of the Nazi war machine. But in the midst of this despair, a new voice emerged. From London, a little-known French general named Charles de Gaulle broadcasts a message of defiance, calling on his countrymen to continue the fight. It was a small spark of hope in the darkest of nights, the beginning of the French resistance and the Free French forces. The battle for France was over, but the battle for the soul of France had just begun. Imagine this. It's late June 1940. 4 weeks, the news has been a relentless drumbeat of defeat. The seemingly invincible French army, the pride of a nation, has been shattered. The government has fled Paris. And now, the final, unthinkable blow has fallen. On June 22nd, in a chilling act of historical revenge, France signs an armistice with Nazi Germany. The location: The location. The exact same railway carriage in the forest of Kebir, where Germany surrendered at the end of the First World War, just 22 years earlier. The emotional shockwave that hits France is impossible to overstate. It's a national trauma, a deep, collective wound. For millions of French citizens, the world has been turned upside down. This isn't just a military defeat. It feels like the end of France itself, the end of a certain idea of civilization, of liberté, égalité, fraternité. A thick, suffocating blanket of shame and disbelief settles over the country. How could this have happened? How could the heroes of Verdun be brought so low, so quickly? This sense of humiliation was profound. The armistice terms were harsh. Germany would occupy the northern and western 3/5 of the country, including Paris and the entire Atlantic coastline. The once mighty French army was to be demobilized and disarmed, reduced to a mere skeleton force. A new, collaborationist government was to be established in the spa town of Vichy. For the average person, this wasn't just a newspaper headline. It was a brutal, daily reality. German soldiers marching down the Champs-Élysées, the swastika flying from the Eiffel Tower. It was a constant, public display of their nation's subjugation. This humiliation was amplified by the sheer speed of the collapse. The phony war had lulled many into a false sense of security. Then came the Blitzkrieg in May, and in just 6 weeks, it was all over. It was a strategic and psychological knockout. People felt betrayed, abandoned by their leaders, and utterly powerless. The newsreels from Kebir, showing Hitler gloating, were a bitter pill to swallow. It felt personal. Every French man and woman felt the sting of that signature. The veterans of the Great War, who had sacrificed so much, were now old men watching their life's work, their victory, being erased before their very eyes. But alongside the shame and the anger, there was another powerful, conflicting emotion: relief. Let's not forget the chaos that preceded the armistice. The roads of France were clogged with millions of refugees, a desperate river of humanity fleeing the German advance. People called it l'exode, the exodus. Families were separated, homes abandoned, and the fear of bombing and strafing was constant. They were hungry, exhausted, and terrified. For these people, the announcement of the armistice, the cessation of fighting, meant one thing above all else: the violence would stop. This desperate longing for peace cannot be underestimated. It's a complicated part of the story we often overlook. They wanted to go home. They wanted to find their lost relatives. They wanted to know if their houses were still standing. They just wanted the killing to end. So, for many, the news was met with a stunned silence, a numb acceptance. The shame was there, yes, but so was the bone-deep weariness of a people who had been pushed to their absolute limit. They craved a return to some semblance of normalcy, even if it was a deeply compromised, occupied normalcy. This complex mix of emotions created a deep division within the French psyche. While Marshal Pétain, the aging hero of Verdun, was broadcasting his message of sacrifice and national renewal from Vichy, promising to shield the French people, another voice was broadcasting from London. A little-known general, Charles de Gaulle, was making his famous appeal of June 18th, declaring that the flame of French resistance must not be extinguished. But in those dark days of June 1940, his voice was a whisper against the roar of defeat. Most people didn't even hear it. Their world was one of immediate survival. The nation was on its knees. The dominant feeling was one of dazed shock. It was a feeling of being completely adrift, cut off from a glorious past and facing a terrifyingly uncertain future. The armistice wasn't just a political event. It was a moment that seared itself into the soul of every French citizen. It was the moment their world broke, a national shock from which it would take years of occupation, resistance, and liberation to finally recover. The summer of 1940 wasn't just a season. It was the beginning of a long, dark night for France. The story of Dunkirk is often told as a miracle of deliverance, a tale of British resilience against overwhelming odds. But there's another side to this story, a much darker, more bitter chapter that's often overlooked, especially in English-speaking countries. This is the story of what happened after the miracle, and how for many in France, Dunkirk wasn't a victory, but a betrayal. Let's rewind to late June 1940. The evacuation, Operation Dynamo, is over. Over 338,000 Allied soldiers have been rescued from the beaches. In Britain, there's a sense of relief, a "we live to fight another day" spirit. But across the Channel, the mood is starkly different. France is on its knees, and the government is about to sign an armistice with Germany. For the French people, the question wasn't just how did this happen, but who is to blame? And for many, the finger pointed squarely at their ally, Great Britain. The core of this bitterness stemmed from the evacuation itself. The popular narrative, the one we often see in movies, is of British and French soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, waiting for rescue. While that was true, the numbers tell a more complicated story. Of the nearly 340,000 men evacuated, about two-thirds were British. Over 120,000 French soldiers were also saved, a heroic feat in itself. But here's the crucial part. Tens of thousands of French soldiers were left behind. These men, who had formed the rearguard, fighting tooth and nail to hold back the German advance, and by time for the evacuation, were now facing inevitable capture. Imagine you're a French civilian. You hear stories of British ships prioritizing British soldiers. You see the headlines and hear the radio broadcasts. The British Expeditionary Force, you're supposed to protect us, are gone. They've returned home, leaving your sons, husbands, and brothers to become prisoners of war. The perception, fair or not, was that Britain had cut and run, saving its own skin while leaving France to face the music alone. The phrase, perfidious Albion, a centuries-old jab at British untrustworthiness, was suddenly on everyone's lips again. This sentiment was heavily fueled by propaganda. The new Vichy government, collaborating with Germany, had every reason to drive a wedge between the French people and their former British allies. They painted Britain as a selfish, unreliable partner who had used France as a shield and then abandoned it. German propaganda, of course, hammered this point home, broadcasting images of captured French soldiers and asking, "Where are your English friends now?" It's easy to see how this narrative took hold. Communication was chaotic. Most people didn't have the full picture. They didn't know about the Royal Navy's incredible losses, or the RF pilots fighting themselves to exhaustion over the beaches. They didn't know that Churchill had ordered British ships to return for the French rearguard, only for the German advance to make it impossible. What they saw was the immediate, devastating reality. The British were safe at home, and the German army was marching into Paris. The bitterness was compounded by another event just a few weeks later in July 1940, the British attack on the French fleet at Mers-el-Kébir in Algeria. Churchill was terrified that the powerful French navy would fall into German hands, tipping the naval balance of power. He gave the French admiral a brutal ultimatum. Sail to a British port. Scuttle your ships, or be destroyed. The French, feeling their national honor was at stake, refused. The Royal Navy opened fire, sinking several French battleships and killing over 1,200 French sailors. For the French, this was the ultimate betrayal. First, Britain abandons their army at Dunkirk, and now they're attacking and killing their sailors there. The Vichy government used the tragedy to its full advantage, portraying Britain as not just an unreliable ally, but an outright enemy. The attack on Mers-el-Kébir cemented the anti-British feeling that had begun to fester in the sands of Dunkirk. It pushed France further into collaboration and made the job of Charles de Gaulle and the Free French, operating from London, incredibly difficult. How could he convince his countrymen to trust the British when they had just fired on the French flag? This bitterness wasn't just political maneuvering. It was a genuine, raw emotion felt by millions. It was the pain of a swift and humiliating defeat, compounded by a feeling of abandonment. Families waited for news of loved ones left behind at Dunkirk, only to learn they were in German prison camps, where many would remain for the next 5 years. The economic hardship, the occupation, the loss of national pride, all of it was, in some way, linked back to that moment when the last ship sighted from Dunkirk. Of course, history is never black and white. The British argument was one of survival. They believed that by saving their army, they were preserving the only force capable of continuing the fight against Hitler. If the BEF had been captured, Britain might have been forced to sue for peace, and the war could have been lost. From their perspective, the evacuation was a harsh necessity. The attack at Mers-el-Kébir, equally brutal, was seen as a grim but essential act to ensure Britain's own survival, and by extension, the eventual liberation of Europe. But in the summer of 1940, these long-term strategic calculations meant little to the average French citizen. What they felt was the immediate sting of defeat and abandonment. The spirit of Dunkirk was a British phenomenon. In France, it was the bitterness of Dunkirk. It created a deep wound in Anglo-French relations that would take years to heal. It's a powerful reminder that even in moments of celebrated heroism, there can be Mossick's side to the story. One filled with pain, resentment, and a very different interpretation of events. Understanding this bitterness is crucial to understanding the full, complex, and often tragic story of 1940. Imagine this. It's the summer of 1940. France has just fallen to Nazi Germany, a shocking and swift collapse that sent tremors across the globe. The French government has signed an armistice, effectively, but what happens to the French Navy, one of the most powerful in the world at the time? This question kept one man up at night, Winston Churchill. He feared that if Hitler got his hands on those French warships, the entire balance of the war could tip. Britain, now standing alone, would face an almost insurmountable naval threat in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. This fear, this desperate calculation, would lead to one of the most painful and controversial episodes of the Second World War. A moment when allies turned their guns on each other. The date is July 3rd, 1940. The place is Mers-el-Kébir, a naval base in French Algeria. Moored in the harbor is a significant portion of the French battle fleet, including the powerful battleships Dunkirk, Strasbourg, Provence, and Britannia. For the French sailors aboard these ships, the past few weeks had been a whirlwind of confusion, defeat, and humiliation. They had been fighting the Germans and Italians just a short time ago. Now, they were technically neutral, bound by the terms of the armistice their government had signed. They were ordered to stay put, their ships disarmed but not surrendered. They believed their honor was intact. They would never let their fleet fall into enemy hands. But across the Mediterranean, Churchill and the British War Cabinet saw the situation differently. They didn't trust Hitler's promises, and they couldn't risk the French fleet being seized. So, they made a good trenchant decision, codenamed Operation Catapult. A powerful British naval squadron, Force H, under the command of Admiral James Somerville, was dispatched from Gibraltar. Their mission, to neutralize the French fleet. At Mers-el-Kébir, one way or another, as the sun rose on July 3rd, the French sailors saw a terrifying sight on the horizon. The silhouettes of the British warships, including the massive aircraft carrier Ark Royal and the battlecruiser Hood. Admiral Somerville was given an ultimatum to deliver to his French counterpart, Admiral Marcel Bruno-Hens. It was a complex set of choices, but none of them were good. The French could sail their ships to British ports and join the fight against Germany, or they could sail to a neutral port, like in the United States, and be or, the final option, they could scuttle their own ships within 6 hours. If none of these were accepted, the Royal Navy had its orders: destroy the French fleet. For Admiral Gonseau, this was an insult of the highest order. He was a proud French officer, and the idea of taking orders from the British, who he felt had abandoned France in its darkest hour, was unthinkable. He also felt bound by his orders from the new French government. Communication was slow and fraught with misunderstanding. Gonseau was reluctant to even show his superiors the full range of options, focusing instead on the demand to scuttle. He felt trapped. His honor, his nation's honor, was on the line. He believed the British wouldn't actually fire on their recent allies. He was wrong. Mers-el-Kébir. The negotiations had failed. Admiral Somerville, with a heavy heart, gave the order to open fire. At 5:54 p.m., the big guns of the British ships roared to life. Shells, each weighing as much as a small car, rained down on the French vessels trapped in the narrow harbor. The French were caught completely off guard. Their ships were moored in a way that made it difficult to return fire effectively. The scene was one of absolute chaos and horror. The battleship Britannia was hit by several shells and exploded in a massive fireball, taking nearly 1,000 of her crew with her. The Provence was heavily damaged and ran aground. The Dunkirk was crippled. It was a massacre. In less than 15 minutes, the pride of the French Navy was a smoking wreck. Only the battleship Strasbourg, under a hail of fire, managed a daring escape, slipping past the British blockade and making it to the open sea. The human cost was devastating. Nearly 1,300 French sailors lost their lives that day. Men who, just weeks before, had considered the British their brothers in arms were now killed by them. The news sent a shockwave of fury and grief through France. The attack was seen as a brutal betrayal, a stab in the back. For the Vichy government, it was a propaganda goldmine, proof that Britain was a treacherous and unreliable ally. Anti-British sentiment soared to new heights. In Britain, the reaction was more subdued, but deeply somber. Churchill himself described it as a hateful decision, but one he believed was absolutely necessary for Britain's survival. In a speech to the House of Commons, he expressed his profound regret but stood firm. He argued that the action, as tragic as it was, sent a clear message to the world, and especially to the United States. Britain would stop at nothing to continue the fight against Hitler. It was a demonstration of ruthless resolve. The attack on Mers-el-Kébir is a classic example of the brutal logic of war. It was a decision made out of fear and strategic necessity. Did the British have to do it? To this day, historians are divided. Some argue that the French would have never allowed their ships to be taken by the Germans and that the attack was an unnecessary tragedy. They point to the fact that the French Navy, its own fleet at Toulon in 1942, to prevent it from falling into German hands, proving their commitment. Others argue that Churchill couldn't afford to take that chance. In the desperate summer of 1940, with Britain's very existence hanging by a thread, the risk was too great. The what-if was a scenario he simply could not allow to unfold. The attack demonstrated to President Roosevelt and the Americans that Britain was in the fight to the bitter end, which may have been crucial in securing future American aid. But beyond the strategic debates, Mers-el-Kébir remains a deep scar in the relationship between Britain and France. It was a moment of profound trauma, where allies became enemies, if only for a day. It highlights the heart-wrenching choices that leaders must make in wartime, where the lives of allies can be weighed against the survival of a nation. It's a story of honor, betrayal, and the terrible, terrible price of war. The echoes of those guns at Mers-el-Kébir remind us that history is never simple, and its most painful lessons are often written in blood. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series on France during the Second World War. Today, we're diving into a complex and often misunderstood period, the summer and autumn of 1940. After the shocking speed of France's military defeat, a new government emerged from the ashes, led by the aging war hero, Marcel-Philippe. This was the Vichy regime, and its promise to the French people was simple: stability. To understand why so many people, especially conservatives and the middle class, initially threw their support behind Pétain, we have to put ourselves in their shoes. Imagine the chaos. Millions of refugees were on the roads, the army had disintegrated, and the government had fled Paris. France was in a state of utter collapse. For the average French citizen, the world had been turned upside down. The armistice, signed on June 22, 1940, was a bitter pill to swallow. It divided the country into an occupied zone in the north, and a so-called free zone in the south, where Pétain's government set up in the Spa-Tang of Vichy. But for many, this bitter pill was preferable to the alternative, the complete unknown. The armistice, at the very least, stopped the fighting. It meant fathers and sons would stop dying on the battlefield. It meant a semblance of order could be restored. This desire for order cannot be overstated. The French bourgeoisie, the business owners, the shopkeepers, the civil servants, they had watched in horror not just the German invasion, but the unraveling of their own society. They feared a communist uprising in the vacuum of power. They remembered the chaos of the Russian Revolution and the civil wars that followed. The Third Republic, which had governed France since 1870, was seen as weak, decadent, and corrupt. Its politicians were blamed for the military unpreparedness and the moral decay that, in Terbiot, had led to the defeat. In their eyes, the Republic had failed spectacularly. Marcel Pétain, on the other hand, was the victor of Verdun, a legendary figure from the First World War. He was 84 years old, a grandfatherly figure who projected an image of traditional values, authority, and self-satisfaction. When he spoke on the radio, his voice was calm and paternal. He told the French people that he was making a gift of his person to France to alleviate its suffering. This resonated deeply with a population desperate for a savior. He wasn't just another politician. He was a symbol of a bygone era of French glory and honor. His message was one of a national revolution. This wasn't just about politics. It was a moral crusade. The new motto, replacing the revolutionary liberty, equality, fraternity, was work, family, fatherland. This new slogan perfectly captured the conservative vision for France. It promised a return to traditional hierarchies and Catholic values. The focus was on discipline, hard work, and respect for authority. For the middle classes, who felt their status and savings were threatened by the pre-war socialist movements and the current chaos, this was music to their ears. It was a promise to turn back the clock, to erase the perceived mistakes of the liberal, secular Third Republic. They saw Pétain's government not as a step towards fascism, but as a necessary authoritarian hand to guide the nation back to its senses. The government immediately took steps that reinforced this image of restoring order. It launched public works programs to get people back to work. It cracked down on undesirables, and it promoted a cult of personality around Pétain himself. His portrait was everywhere, presented as the wise father figure who would protect his children. This propaganda was incredibly effective. It reassured people that someone was finally in charge, cleaning up the mess left by the politicians. Many French business leaders also saw Vichy as a pragmatic choice. They believed that collaborating with Germany on an economic level was the only way to keep their factories running and prevent the complete collapse of the French economy. They saw it as making the best of a terrible situation, a way to preserve French industry and infrastructure for a future when, they hoped, things might be different. They convinced themselves that this was a form of resistance, in itself saving the economic backbone of the nation. It's crucial to remember that in the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone, and a German victory in the war seemed not just possible, but highly probable. Charles de Gaulle's famous appeal from London on June 18th was heard by very few in France. He was seen by many as a renegade, a junior general who was betraying his superiors and gambling on a lost cause. Supporting Pétain seemed like the only realistic, patriotic option. It was framed as a choice between order under Pétain or total chaos and German domination. For a population traumatized by defeat and terrified of the future, the choice seemed clear. Vichy offered a shield, however flawed, against the storm. It promised to keep the German army out of the southern zone, to maintain a French administration, and to protect the French people as much as possible. This was the Vichy promise. Of course, we now know the dark reality of this promise. We know that this pursuit of stability led to active collaboration with the Nazi regime, including the persecution of Jews and political opponents. The shield proved to be a cage, but in those initial months, for millions of French citizens reeling from an unprecedented national trauma, the Vichy government seemed to be the only thing standing between them and the abyss. Understanding this perspective is not about justifying their choices, but about grasping the complex and tragic reality of France in 1940. It shows how, in times of extreme crises, the appeal of a strong man promising order can be incredibly powerful. Join us next time as we explore how this initial support began to fracture and the seeds of resistance began to grow. The shock of invasion is settled, and a new, grim reality is dawning across Europe. This isn't a story of grand battles, but of the silent, daily struggle for survival and sanity. Imagine waking up one morning to find your world turned upside down. The familiar streets, are now patrolled by foreign soldiers. The flag flying over the town hall is not your own. This was the reality for millions. The first and most immediate change was the disappearance of, well, everything. Shortages became the new normal. Think about your weekly grocery run. Now picture the shelves half empty. The fresh bread you love, gone, replaced by a dense, dark loaf made with more potato flour and sawdust than actual grain. Meat became a luxury. A memory whispered about at the dinner table. A single egg was a treasure. Families who once enjoyed hearty meals now found themselves carefully rationing every single crumb. Ration cards became the currency of life. These little booklets dictated exactly how much food a person was entitled to each week. A few ounces of butter, a meager portion of sugar, a small cut of questionable meat. It was never enough. A thriving black market quickly emerged. A dangerous world of secret deals and whispered prices. People traded family heirlooms, a grandmother's ring, a silver watch for a bag of real flour or a few pounds of potatoes. But getting caught could mean severe punishment. It was a constant, gnawing gamble between hunger and safety. It wasn't just food. Fuel was scarce. Coal for heating became incredibly precious. Families would huddle together in one room during the freezing winters to conserve warmth. Clothing was mended, then mended again, until it was more patched than original fabric. Children wore shoes, stuffed with newspaper to cover the holes. Life became a master class in making do, in finding ingenious ways to stretch resources that were stretched to their breaking point. Beyond the physical hardship was the psychological warfare. The occupation wasn't just about controlling territory. It was about controlling minds. Censorship fell like a thick blanket over society. Newspapers, once vibrant with debate and local news, now printed only what the occupying authorities approved. Articles were filled with German victories and glowing reports about the new order. Any dissenting voices were silenced. Journalists who dared to write the truth disappeared. Radios were another battleground. People would huddle in secret, curtains drawn, listening to forbidden broadcasts from the BBC, the volume turned down to a whisper. These crackly voices from London, like Winston Churchill's defiant speeches, were lifelines of hope. They were a reminder that the outside world hadn't forgotten them, that resistance was still alive. But again, the risk was immense. Owning an untuned radio or being caught listening to enemy broadcasts could lead to arrest and imprisonment. Propaganda was everywhere, inescapable. Posters plastered on every wall depicted smiling German soldiers helping elderly women or sharing sweets with children. They promoted a vision of a peaceful, prosperous Europe under German leadership. The message was clear. Cooperate, and life will be good. Resist, and you will suffer. Films and cinemas were preceded by newsreels showcasing the might of the German military and the supposed weaknesses of the Allies. School children were given new textbooks that rewrote history, glorifying the occupiers and vilifying their own national heritage. The goal was to sever the connection to the past, to make people forget who they were and accept the new reality as permanent. This constant barrage of misinformation and control created an atmosphere of deep paranoia and psychological strain. Who could you trust? A friendly neighbor might be an informer, reporting conversations to the authorities for a little extra food or favor. A casual remark in a cafe could be overheard. The walls literally had ears. This constant fear eroded the very fabric of community. People became isolated, withdrawn. The simple joy of a public gathering was replaced with suspicion. Laughter on the streets felt out of place, almost rebellious. The psychological toll was immense. People lived with a knot of anxiety in their stomachs, a perpetual state of looking over their shoulder. The stress manifested in sleepless nights, quiet despair, and a profound sense of loss for the world that had vanished so suddenly. Yet, even in this oppressive darkness, the human spirit flickered. Small acts of defiance became acts of immense courage. A baker might slip an extra roll to a hungry child. A doctor might falsify a medical certificate to save someone from forced labor. People would secretly share news from the BBC, passing it along in hushed tones. These weren't grand acts of sabotage, but they were vital. They were affirmations of humanity in the face of an inhuman regime. They were tiny sparks of resistance that kept the flame of hope alive, whispering that this long, dark night would not last forever. Life under occupation was a daily grind, a test of endurance. It was about surviving the hunger, evading the propaganda, and holding on to one's identity when everything and everyone was trying to strip it away. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that so many endured, holding on to the hope for a dawn they couldn't yet see. Have you ever wondered what it was like when the world seemed to be on the brink of collapse? Imagine this. It's 1940. One by one, the nations of Europe have fallen to the relentless German war machine. France, the great bastion of liberty on the continent, has surrendered. For many, it felt like the lights were going out all over the world. The future looked bleak, dominated by a seemingly unstoppable tyranny. From across the Atlantic, many in America watched with a growing sense of dread. But then, something incredible happened. One nation stood alone, defiant and unbroken. Great Britain. This moment, this singular act of defiance, sent shockwaves across the globe, and nowhere were they felt more keenly than among the political left in America. For them, this wasn't just a distant war between old European empires. It was the front line in a universal struggle for freedom and human dignity. Today, we're diving deep into this often overlooked chapter of history, exploring how American workers, intellectuals, and students saw Britain's lonely stand not as a defeat, but as a blazing symbol of hope. Let's set the scene. In the United States, the late 1930s had been a time of intense political debate. The Great Depression had shaken the foundations of capitalism, and many on the left were deeply critical of the existing system. They were anti-fascist to their core, having watched with horror as Franco rose in Spain, Mussolini in Italy, and of course, Hitler in Germany. Yet, there was a strong current of isolationism in America. Many remembered the brutal cost of World War I and were determined to stay out of another European conflict. This created a huge tension, especially on the left. How could you be passionately anti-fascist, but also advocate for staying out of the fight against the world's most powerful fascist regime? This all changed in the summer of 1940, when Winston Churchill delivered his famous "We shall fight on the beaches" speech. His words echoed far beyond the shores of Britain. For American leftists, who had felt a growing sense of despair, this was a jolt of electricity. Here was a leader, a nation, that refused to bow. They weren't just fighting for their own survival. In the eyes of many, they were fighting for the future of democracy itself. Let's start with the intellectuals and writers. People like the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who had previously been a pacifist, began to argue that there were times when force was necessary to combat a greater evil. He saw the Nazi ideology as a profound threat to Christian and democratic values, a demonic force that had to be stopped. Writers and journalists, many of whom had reported on the Spanish Civil War and seen the brutality of fascism firsthand, began to fill the pages of magazines like The Nation and The New Republic with passionate arguments for aiding Britain. They weren't naive about the British Empire or its flaws, but they understood what was at stake. This was a people's war, a term that began to gain currency. The fight wasn't for kings or colonies, but for the common person against tyranny. This sentiment trickled down from the intellectual elite to college campuses. Students, who just a few years earlier might have been signing peace pledges, were now forming committees to support Britain. They organized rallies, raised funds for medical supplies, and lobbied politicians to repeal the Neutrality Acts that were hamstrung any aid efforts. They saw the young pilots in the Royal Air Force fighting against overwhelming odds in the Battle of Britain as heroes of their own generation. It was a powerful, romantic image. A small band of brothers defending civilization from the sky. For these students, the abstract political debates suddenly became very real and very personal. Their own futures, their own freedoms, were being decided in the skies over London. Now, what about the labor movement? This is a fascinating part of the story. American labor was deeply divided. Some union leaders, influenced by the Communist Party line, which, at that time, was dictated by the Nazi-Soviet Pact, officially opposed intervention. They painted the conflict as just another imperialist war. But for many rank-and-file workers, this argument didn't sit right. They were instinctively they knew that in Nazi Germany, trade unions had been one of the first things to be crushed. their leaders arrested or killed. The stories coming out of Britain resonated powerfully with them. They heard about British factory workers, men and women, working around the clock to build Spitfires and Hurricanes. They read about the incredible spirit of the Blitz, where ordinary Londoners, after a night of devastating bombing, would clear the ruble and go right back to work. This wasn't a war of aristocrats. It was a war being fought and won by working people. Leaders of major unions like the International Ladies' Garment Workers Union, with its large Jewish and socialist membership, were among the most vocal in their support for Britain. They organized massive rallies in places like Madison Square Garden, declaring their solidarity with their British counterparts. For them, Britain's fight was their fight. A victory for Hitler would mean the end of the labor movement everywhere. This period, from 1940 to 1941, before the United States officially entered the war, was a time of profound transformation. The American left, which had been fragmented and often at odds with itself, found a unifying cause. The lonely defiance of Great Britain provided a powerful moral clarity. It cut through the complex arguments about isolationism and neutrality. Suddenly, the choice seemed simple. You were either on the side of the bombers or the side of the people huddled in the shelters. Even popular culture began to reflect this shift. Hollywood, which had been hesitant to produce overtly anti-Nazi films, started releasing movies like Mrs. Minover, which depicted the quiet heroism of an ordinary British family during the Blitz. These films were enormously powerful propaganda, shaping public opinion and reinforcing the idea that Britain's struggle was a noble one. The film portrayed a kind of democratic resilience that Americans could identify with and admire. It wasn't about generals and grand strategy. It was about tending your roses in the face of Armageddon. This groundswell of support from workers, students, and intellectuals created immense pressure on the Roosevelt administration. While FDR was personally sympathetic to Britain's plight, he had to navigate the powerful isolationist bloc in Congress and the country. The vocal support from these left-wing groups gave him the political space he needed to push through crucial aid programs, like the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941. This act effectively turned the United States into the arsenal of democracy, providing Britain with the weapons and supplies it desperately needed to carry on the fight. So when we look back at this pivotal moment, it's crucial to remember it wasn't just presidents and politicians who shaped history. It was the millions of ordinary people who refused to accept defeat. The American left, in all its diverse and sometimes contradictory forms, played a vital role. They saw Britain's darkest hour as a beacon of hope. They understood that the defense of a distant island was inseparable from the defense of their own ideals of freedom, equality, and justice. They refused to let the lights go out, and by doing so, they helped light the path that would eventually lead to victory. In the summer of 1940, the situation looked grim. France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk, and Hitler stood on the French coast, gazing across the English Channel. For many, it seemed like the end. Britain was isolated, seemingly defenseless against the might of the German war machine. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, delivered a speech that would echo through history. The Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. This wasn't just rhetoric. This was the stark reality. Operation Sea Lion, the planned German invasion of Great Britain, depended on one critical factor: air superiority. The Luftwaffe, Germany's powerful air force, was tasked with destroying the Royal Air Force, or RAF, both in the air and on the ground. If they could achieve this, nothing could stop their invasion fleet. From August 1940, the skies over southern England became a relentless battlefield. The fate of the free world rested on the shoulders of a few thousand young pilots. The German strategy was methodical. In the initial phase, known as Adlertag or Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe targeted British coastal radar stations, airfields, and aircraft factories. The goal was to blind the RFS command and control system and cripple its ability to fight back. Day after day, hundreds of German bombers, escorted by Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters, swarmed across the Channel. The iconic images of dogfights, of white contrails crisscrossing the blue summer sky, became a daily spectacle. For the pilots of RAF Fighter Command, the pressure was immense. They were outnumbered, often flying several sorties a day. scrambling to their Spitfires and Hurricanes at a moment's notice. The sound of the scramble bell meant dropping everything and sprinting to their aircraft. They would climb to intercept the incoming German formations. Exhausted but determined. Every engagement was a life-or-death struggle. The average life expectancy of a new pilot during the height of the battle was terrifyingly short, but the British had a few crucial advantages. First, they were fighting over home territory. A bailed-out RAF pilot could be back at his airfield and flying another mission the same day. A downed Luftwaffe pilot, however, became a prisoner of war. Second, the British had a revolutionary air defense network, the Dowding system. This integrated system linked radar stations with observer posts, funneling information to a central command hub, where enemy raids could be tracked and fighters efficiently dispatched to intercept them. It was a technological and strategic masterpiece, allowing the RAF to manage its limited resources effectively. And then, there were the planes, the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane. The Spitfire, with its sleek elliptical wings, became the icon of the battle, a superior fighter at high altitudes. But the steady, reliable Hurricane was the real workhorse. It was responsible for shooting down more enemy aircraft than all other defenses combined. Together, these two aircraft, flown by pilots from Britain, the Commonwealth, and allied nations like Poland and Czechoslovakia, formed a formidable defense. Bilat August, the Luftwaffe, was paying a heavy price for its attacks on airfields. They were losing more aircraft and experienced crews than they could afford. But they were also inflicting serious damage. The RAF was being worn down. Fighter command was stretched to its breaking point, just when it seemed the British couldn't hold on much longer. A critical mistake by the Germans changed the course of the battle. On the night of August 24th, a group of German bombers, lost and off course, accidentally dropped their bombs on London. It was a violation of Hitler's direct orders not to bomb the capital. In retaliation, Churchill ordered a small Huff bomber raid on Berlin. The raid did little physical damage, but the psychological impact on the German leadership, especially Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, was immense. He had boasted that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the German capital. Enraged, Hitler ordered a change in strategy. He diverted the Luftwaffe's focus from destroying the RAF's infrastructure to terrorizing the British public. On September 7, 1940, the Blitz began. Hundreds of bombers descended upon London, setting the docklands ablaze. The Germans believed that by bombing civilians, they could break British morale and force them to surrender. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. While the Blitz brought immense suffering to the people of London and other cities, it had the opposite effect on their spirit. It unified the country in a shared sense of defiance. And crucially, it gave RAF Fighter Command a desperately needed break. With the pressure lifted from their airfields and command centers, they had time to repair, rearm, and rest their exhausted pilots. The factories, now under less threat, could ramp up production of new Spitfires and Hurricanes. The shift in German strategy was the turning point. On September 15th, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched a massive, all-out daylight assault on London, believing the RAF to be on its last legs. They were wrong. They were met by a large and coordinated force of RAF fighters. The ensuing aerial battles were some of the largest and most intense of the entire campaign. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe had suffered devastating losses, a blow from which they would not recover. This day is now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day. It became clear to the German High Command that air superiority over England was unattainable. 2 days later, Hitler indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion. The invasion was off. The Battle of Britain had been won. Meanwhile, across the Channel in occupied France, the population was living under a cloud of defeat and uncertainty. The initial shock of the German victory in June had led to a sense of resignation. The propaganda of the Vichy regime and the Germans was everywhere, proclaiming the might of the new order and the inevitability of a German victory. The sight of German soldiers marching through Paris, the swastika flying from the Eiffel Tower, it all pointed to a dark and seemingly permanent reality. Britain, they were told, was next. In the early weeks of the battle, news was scarce and heavily censored. People relied on whispers, rumors, and the forbidden broadcasts of the BBC French service. Charles de Gaulle's famous Appel du 18 juin, his call to resistance from London, had been a spark, but it was a small spark in a vast darkness. For many, hope was a dangerous luxury. Resisting seemed futile. But then, things started to change. People living on the French coast began to notice things. They saw the huge formations of German planes flying out towards England in the morning, and in the evening, they saw fewer returning. Sometimes they would see German aircraft limping back, damaged, trailing smoke. They would find wreckage washed up on the beaches, and they would hear the stories from German soldiers, stories of fierce resistance, of the deadly British fighters. The BBC broadcasts, listened to in secret, started to tell a different story from the official propaganda. They spoke of the RAF's successes, listing the numbers of German planes shot down. At first, many were skeptical. It sounded too good to be true. But as the whispers from the coast and the evidence of their own eyes began to match the news from London, a slow, cautious shift began to take place. The idea that the seemingly invincible Germans could be beaten, that the British were not only holding on but were actually winning, was electrifying. It was a crack in the armor of German invincibility. It transformed the perception of Britain from a doomed island nation to a bastion of defiance. Every RF victory was a victory for them, too. This news breathed life into the fledgling resistance movements. If Britain could stand alone and fight back, then so could they. The Battle of Britain didn't just save Great Britain from invasion. It saved the flame of hope in occupied Europe. It sent a powerful message that the war was not over, that victory was still possible. The defiant stand of those few pilots in the skies over Kent and Sussex resonated across the water, strengthening the will to resist and laying the psychological groundwork for the long, hard fight for liberation that was to come. Churchill summed it up perfectly. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. His words were meant for the British people, but they were heard and deeply felt by millions living in the shadow of occupation. The year is 1940. France has fallen. The swastika flies over Paris. For many French citizens, the future looks bleak. A long, dark tunnel with no end in sight. The official voice of the nation is now Radio Paris, broadcasting the propaganda of the Vichy regime and its German masters. It paints a picture of a new European order, one where Britain is weak, defeated, and on the brink of collapse. It tells the French people that resistance is futile, that collaboration is the only path to survival. But in the quiet of their homes, another sound was beginning to break through the static. 4 musical notes. Da-da-da-dum. The opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. A symbol of fate knocking at the door. This was the call sign of the BBC's French language service. Ici à Londres, or Here is London. Tuning in was a crime, an act of defiance that could lead to arrest, imprisonment, or worse. Yet, night after night, millions of ordinary French people risked everything to listen. They would gather around their bulky radio sets, the volume turned down low, a blanket often thrown over the device, and their heads to muffle the sound. They strained to hear the voices from across the channel, voices that spoke not of defeat, but of defiance. Voices that told a different story. They heard Winston Churchill's defiant speeches, the roar of RAF's spit, and reports of British resilience during the Blitz. The BBC became a lifeline, a fragile thread of hope in a world consumed by despair. These broadcasts were more than just news. They were a counter-narrative. When Vichy radio claimed the Royal Air Force was decimated, the BBC would broadcast the real numbers of downed German planes. When German propaganda showed images of London in ruins and a demoralized populace, ICI Landres shared stories of Londoners pulling together, of their unbreakable spirit. This wasn't just information. It was a psychological weapon, chipping away at the foundation of the occupation's authority. The information heard on these clandestine broadcasts didn't stay behind closed doors. It spread cautiously at first, like ripples in a pond. A butcher might whisper to a trusted customer, "Did you hear? The British shot down 50 of their planes yesterday." A baker, while wrapping a loaf of bread, might subtly mention a rumor about a successful British naval action. These whispers, these shared secrets, were acts of quiet rebellion. They were a way of saying, "We are not alone. Hope is not lost." This created a strange, dual reality for the French people. Publicly, they had to endure the constant barrage of Vichy propaganda, the posters, the newsreels. The radio broadcasts all screamed the same message of German invincibility and British collapse. But privately, a different truth was taking root. People began to read between the lines of official reports, to question the narrative they were being fed. Why did the Germans insist so vehemently that Britain was finished, if it were actually true? The very intensity of the propaganda began to betray its own weakness. This growing skepticism was a crucial turning point. It marked the shift from stunned submission to quiet, intellectual resistance. It was the birth of a collective understanding that the official story was a lie. People started to develop a sixth sense for propaganda, learning to decode the messages and spot the inconsistencies. They were relearning how to think for themselves after the initial shock of defeat. This muted admiration for Britain's lone stand was incredibly important. At a time when France itself was divided and occupied, Britain's fight became a proxy for their own aspirations for freedom. Every British victory, no matter how small, was a victory for them too. It proved that the mighty German war machine was not invincible. It nourished the seeds of what would become the French resistance. The simple act of listening to a forbidden radio broadcast became a powerful statement. It was a personal declaration of independence, a refusal to accept the new reality imposed upon them. It was in these shared moments, huddled around a radio in a darkened room, that the spirit of a free France was kept alive. They were listening not just to news reports, but to the sound of hope itself, broadcasts from an island that refused to surrender. And as 1940 drew to a close, that hope was beginning to grow, quietly but surely, in the hearts of millions. The admiration was no longer entirely silent. It was starting to find its voice in whispers, in knowing glances, and in the shared secret of 4 simple musical notes. The year is late 1940. Most of Europe lies under the shadow of the swastika. France has fallen, and the might of the German war machine seems unstoppable. Across the English Channel, Britain stands alone, battered by the Blitz, but defiantly unbroken. It's a flicker of hope in a world consumed by darkness. And that flicker, that refusal to surrender, ignited something powerful in the hearts of ordinary people across occupied Europe. This is the story of how that spark grew into a flame. Imagine you're living in Paris, Brussels, or Amsterdam. Every day, you see enemy soldiers on your streets. Your newspapers print propaganda. Your radio broadcasts their victories. Fear is a constant companion. Yet, amidst this despair, whispers begin. The news from Britain, smuggled in through illicit radio broadcasts, tells a different story, a story of defiance. Churchill's powerful speeches, promising to fight on the beaches and in the streets, were more than just words. They were a call to action. For many, the thought was simple. If the British aren't giving up, we so leb. This idea took root first among the young and idealistic university students, who once debated philosophy in cafes, now met in secret. They started with small acts. At the Sorbonne in Paris, students began scribbling the cross of Lorraine, a symbol of free France, on walls and blackboards. They would quietly hum La Marseillaise in lecture halls, a subtle act of rebellion that was instantly understood by their peers. These weren't trained spies or soldiers. They were kids, armed with chalk, courage, and an unshakable belief in freedom. On November 11th, 1940, Armistice Day, this student-led defiance erupted. In Paris, thousands of students marched to the Arc de Triomphe to lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier. It was a direct challenge to the occupiers. The response was brutal. The gathering was violently broken up, but the message had been sent. The spirit of France was not dead. This event, though costly, was a major turning point. It showed that organized, public resistance was possible, and it inspired others to join the fight in their own ways. Simultaneously, another group of unsung heroes was mobilizing: the railway workers. The German war effort depended on Europe's vast rail network to move troops, supplies, and plundered resources. The railway workers, engine drivers, signalman mechanics, realized they held a powerful weapon. They couldn't fight with guns, but they could fight with wrenches and timetables. They became the masters of subtle sabotage. This wasn't about blowing up bridges, at least not yet. The early efforts were more ingenious. A little sand in a locomotive's axle box could cause a breakdown miles down the line. Mislabeling freight cars could send a shipment of vital machine parts on a scenic tour of the countryside instead of to a factory. Deliberately misinterpreting signals could create massive, inexplicable delays, snarling German logistics for days. These men and women risked everything. A workplace accident was a perfect cover. But if caught, the penalty was severe. They were the silent saboteurs, waging a war of disruption from within the system. One of the most effective groups was the French resistance or iron resistance. They developed a sophisticated network. Information was their currency. They would track the movements of German troop trains, noting the number of cars, the types of equipment, and the destination. This intelligence was priceless. They would pass it along through clandestine channels, often written on cigarette papers and hidden in a lunchbox. This information would eventually make its way to London, where it helped Allied command build a detailed picture of German military operations. Every delayed train and every piece of intelligence was a small victory. While students and workers fought from the outside and inside the system, another battle was being waged in the halls of bureaucracy. Civil servants, the very people tasked with implementing the occupation's orders, began their own quiet rebellion. These were mayors, police officers, and clerks who were forced to work under the new regime. Outwardly, they complied. Inwardly, they resisted. Their methods were a masterclass in bureaucratic warfare. A request for supplies from a German garrison might get lost in a pile of paperwork. Identity cards needed for forced labor drafts would be issued with deliberate errors, making them invalid. Food ration documents might be accidentally duplicated, allowing precious extra food to go to families in need instead of being requisitioned. Think about the courage this took. These civil servants were walking a tightrope. They had to appear cooperative to their new masters, while secretly undermining their authority at every turn. A police chief might receive an order to round up suspected resistance members. He would then dispatch his officers with just enough of a delay, or to the wrong address, to allow the targets to escape. It was a dangerous game of deception, where a single mistake could lead to a prison cell, or worse. They used the oppressor's own red tape to tie their hands. These disparate group students, railway workers, civil servants were the first seeds. They often didn't know each other. They operated in small, isolated cells, driven by a shared, unspoken conviction. A printer might secretly run off a few hundred anti-German leaflets at night. A housewife might offer a spare room as a safe house for a night. A doctor might falsify a medical certificate to save a young man from being sent to a labor camp. The year 1941 saw these seeds begin to sprout and connect. Clandestine newspapers, printed on hidden presses and passed from hand to hand, started to appear. These papers, like Liberation and Combat, were vital. They countered German propaganda, shared news from the BBC, and offered practical advice on how to resist. They created a sense of a shared struggle, letting isolated individuals know they were not alone. Reading one of these papers was an act of defiance. Possessing one was a crime. Distributing them was a capital offense. Yet, they spread like wildfire, a testament to people's thirst for truth. These early days of resistance were about building networks, learning to trust, and discovering what was possible. It was a period of trial and error, marked by both successes and tragic failures. But through it all, the spirit of defiance grew stronger. Britain's lonely stand had shown them that resistance was not futile. Now, from the lecture halls of the Sorbonne, to the railway yards of Belgium and the town halls of the Netherlands, ordinary people were proving it. They were laying the foundation for the vast, organized resistance movements that would later play a crucial role in the liberation of Europe. Their story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, the courage of a few can light a fire that changes the world. Today, we're diving into a pivotal period, 1941 to 1942, a time when a divided France began to learn how to hope again. After the shocking defeat of 1940, France was split. In the south, Marshal Pétain's Vichy government preached a message of national renewal through collaboration with Germany. In the north, under direct German occupation, life was a daily struggle. But beneath the surface, the tide of public opinion was starting to turn. Initially, many French citizens, stunned and demoralized, saw Pétain as a shield, a necessary evil to protect what was left of their nation. The Vichy regime controlled the media, plastering posters everywhere that glorified Pétain as the savior of France. They promoted a return to traditional values: work, family, and fatherland. This message resonated with some who were tired of the political turmoil of the Third Republic and blamed it for the defeat. Collaboration wasn't just a policy. For some, it was a genuine belief that aligning with the seemingly victorious Germany was the only pragmatic path forward. They saw Britain as a former ally who had abandoned them at Dunkirk and even attacked their fleet at Mers-el-Kébir. So, for a time, collaborationists held significant sway, arguing that cooperation was the key to survival and eventual sovereignty. However, as 1941 unfolded, the reality of German occupation started to bite hard. The Germans were requisitioning food, fuel, and industrial goods, leading to severe shortages for the French population. Rationing became stricter, and the black market thrived, creating widespread inequality and resentment. People in the occupied zone saw the German presence not as a temporary arrangement, but as a brutal, exploitative force. Executions of hostages in retaliation for attacks on German soldiers sent shockwaves of horror through the country. The illusion that collaboration would soften the occupation was crumbling fast. Meanwhile, two powerful voices were cutting through the collaborationist propaganda. From London, Charles de Gaulle's Free French broadcasts on the BBC became a beacon of hope. His famous call to arms on June 18, 1940, had initially been heard by few, but now more and more people were secretly tuning in. De Gaulle's message was simple and unwavering. The war was not over, the defeat was not final, and the fight for France's honor and freedom must continue. He represented an alternative, a defiant spirit that refused to accept subjugation. His voice, coming through the crackle of a forbidden radio, was a lifeline to a different future, one where France would be liberated and restored to its place among the victorious allies. Simultaneously, Britain's resilience was having a profound effect. The Royal Air Force's victory in the Battle of Britain in late 1940 had already shown that Germany was not invincible. Throughout 1941, despite the Blitz and the U-boat menace in the Atlantic, Britain stood firm. For many in France, Britain was no longer the perfidious Albion that Vichy propaganda portrayed, but a steadfast ally, the last bastion of freedom in Europe. Winston Churchill's defiant speeches, often quoted in clandestine pamphlets, became legendary. The French people saw Britain fighting on, alone, and a sense of shared destiny and admiration began to grow. This wasn't just about sentiment. It was a strategic calculation. If Britain could hold out, then perhaps, just perhaps, the war could still be won. Then came the turning point. Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. This completely changed the landscape. For the powerful French Communist Party, which had been officially neutral due to the Nazi-Soviet pact, the war was now their war. They threw their formidable organizational skills into the resistance, launching sabotage operations and guerrilla attacks. This dramatically escalated the level of active opposition to the occupiers and, by extension, to the Vichy regime that enabled them. The invasion also meant that Germany was now fighting a massive war on two fronts. The myth of German invincibility, already dented by the Battle of Britain, was further shattered. Hope, once a scarce commodity, was spreading. As we move into late 1941 and early 1942, the gap between the two sides of France widened into a chasm. On one side were the collaborators, increasingly seen not as pragmatists but as traitors, servants of a brutal foreign power. Their arguments for cooperation sounded hollow as German demands became more extreme, including the conscription of French workers to be sent to factories in Germany. The Vichy government's complicity in the persecution of Jews also horrified many ordinary citizens, pushing them away from the regime. The collaborationist camp was becoming more isolated, its supporters dwindling to a core of ideologues and opportunists. On the other side was a growing coalition of defiance. It wasn't a single, unified movement yet, but a collection of disparate groups united by a common goal: liberation. There were the Gaullists, loyal to the general in London. There were the Communists, now a major force in the armed struggle. And there were countless ordinary men and women, conservatives, Catholics, atheists, who formed local resistance networks. They published underground newspapers, helped downed Allied airmen escape, gathered intelligence, and carried out acts of sabotage. They were inspired by the endurance of Britain and the vast struggle on the Eastern Front. They were learning to trust de Gaulle, not just as a voice, but as the legitimate leader of fighting France. This period, from 1941 to 1942, was crucial. It was when the soul of France was truly being contested. The initial shock of defeat gave way to a grim reality, and that reality forced a choice. Would France accept a subordinate role in a German-dominated Europe, as proposed by Vichy, or would it rediscover its fighting spirit and reclaim its freedom, as championed by de Gaulle and the burgeoning resistance? While the collaborators still held the official power, their moral authority was collapsing. The hearts and minds of the French people were shifting decisively toward resistance and hope. The nation was still divided, still suffering, but for the first time since the dark days of 1940, a path to liberation, however distant and dangerous, was starting to become visible. Thank you for watching this chapter of our journey through the war. The story of the French resistance is just beginning, and it's a tale of incredible courage and sacrifice. Today, we're diving into a fascinating and often overlooked chapter of World War II history. The complex, emotional roller coaster that defined the relationship between France and Britain. It's a story that moves from deep-seated bitterness to a hard-won brotherhood, a journey that truly began to unfold in the pivotal year of 1944. To understand the tension, we have to rewind a bit. Think back to 1940. The fall of France was a catastrophic event, a national trauma. From the French perspective, the British Expeditionary Forces' evacuation at Dunkirk, while a miracle for Britain, felt like an abandonment. It left the French army to face the full, overwhelming might of the German war machine alone. This sense of being left behind planted the first seeds of resentment. Then came the painful episode at Mers-el-Kébir. In July 1940, the British Royal Navy attacked the French fleet, anchored in Algeria to prevent it from falling into German hands. For Churchill, it was a brutal but necessary calculation to show the world, especially America, that Britain would fight on at all costs. But for France, it was a shocking betrayal. Over 1,000 French sailors were killed by their recent allies. The news sent shockwaves of anger and grief across France. It was a wound that would fester for years, skillfully exploited by Vichy propaganda, which painted Britain not as an ally, but as a perfidious, self-interested enemy. Throughout the long years of occupation, this narrative of perfidious Auvion was a constant whisper. Every Allied bombing raid on French soil, even those targeting German infrastructure, resulted in civilian casualties. And while these were tragic necessities of war, for a population suffering under occupation, it was easy to see the British as bringers of more death and destruction, not as The average French citizen, struggling for daily survival, had a very complicated view of their cross-canal neighbor. On the other side of this equation was Charles de Gaulle. From his base in London, he broadcasted messages of hope and resistance, becoming the voice of free France. Yet, his relationship with the British, and with Winston Churchill in particular, was famously stormy. De Gaulle was fiercely protective of French sovereignty, often clashing with his hosts over strategy, command, and the future of France. He saw himself as the guardian of France's honor, and he bristled at any perceived slight or attempt to treat France as a junior partner. This political friction at the highest levels mirrored the complex emotions felt by ordinary people. So, you have this incredibly tense backdrop, a mixture of old rivalries, fresh betrayals, and the daily hardships of war. This was the emotional landscape as 1944 dawned. The promise of liberation was in the air, but so was a great deal of uncertainty and apprehension. Then came June 6, 1944. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history, as British, American, and Canadian troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. Alongside their free French comrades, something began to shift. The sight of those landing craft, the sheer scale of the Allied commitment, was a powerful visual testament. This wasn't an abandonment. This was a return in force. For the people of Normandy, the first to be liberated, the feeling was overwhelming. Decades of accounts from Norman villagers described the initial shock, the fear of the battle raging around them, and then the dawning, tearful realization that freedom was at hand. They saw young British soldiers, far from home, fighting and dying to free their towns. These personal human contact began to melt away the ice of the preceding 4 years. Sharing a piece of bread, a cup of water, or a simple smile with a British Tommy did more to heal the wounds of propaganda than any political speech ever could. As the Allies fought their way inland, through the brutal bocage country of Normandy, the cost of liberation became terrifyingly clear. Entire towns, like Caen, were decimated in the fighting. The battle for Caen was particularly long and bloody, largely a British and Canadian effort, and while the destruction was immense, a new understanding began to form. The French people saw firsthand that this was not a war of choice for the soldiers fighting it. It was a grueling, horrific necessity. The destruction wasn't wanton. It was the price of dislodging a deeply entrenched and fanatical enemy. This is where the narrative pivots from bitterness to a shared sense of sacrifice. The French saw British cemeteries filling up with young men who had crossed the Channel to die for France's freedom. The scale of that sacrifice was undeniable. It was a debt of blood that spoke louder than any past grievance. When Paris was liberated in August 1944, the joy was ecstatic. And while American troops and the French 2nd Armored Division are most famously associated with that moment, the broader campaign that made it possible was an Allied effort. The British contribution, from the strategic bombing that crippled German logistics to the dogged fighting in the north, was an essential part of the puzzle. In the months following the liberation, as life slowly began to return to a semblance of normality, a deeper reflection took hold. The French had to reconcile the propaganda they had been fed for 4 years with the reality they had just witnessed. The perfidious Albion who had attacked their fleet was also the Albion that had sheltered de Gaulle, armed the resistance, and sent its sons to die on French soil. The relationship was never simple. There were still disagreements, cultural clashes, and a healthy dose of rivalry. The French are, after all, French, and the British are British, but the shared experience of 1944 forged a new kind of bond. It wasn't the formal alliance of governments. It was a deeper, more human connection. It was a brotherhood born in the crucible of war. The bitterness of 1940 hadn't been forgotten, but it had been overshadowed by the immense gratitude of 1944. The anger over Mers-el-Kébir was tempered by the admiration for the soldiers who fought through Normandy. It was the understanding that in the darkest moments of the 20th century, when faced with an existential threat, they had ultimately stood together. This complex journey from anger to admiration is a powerful reminder that history is not black and white. It's lived by real people, with complex emotions. The story of Franco-British relations during World War II is not just about grand strategy and politics. It's about a long, difficult, but ultimately triumphant journey from bitterness to brotherhood. A journey cemented forever on the battlefields of 1944. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this slice of history interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. See you next time.